So it looks like we have most everybody here who's joining, for which many thanks. It's great to see, quote unquote, see you. And welcome for those whom I haven't met. My name is Johannes von Moltke, and I'm the director of CREASE, which is hosting this event as part of its noon lecture series. I will take the opportunity not to introduce her yet, but to mention a few things about the upcoming lectures, which is to alert you to the fact that, as you probably know, if you've been following the lecture schedule, next week we'll have a very exciting panel of Albanian authors from 3 different generations, reflecting on the role of literature in Albanian society, and we're excited to host them. That will be in this same time, same place next week. So a noon lecture Wednesday, March 31st, and the details are on our website. We're also very excited to have been able to add one final event to this year's lineup, and I'm happy to see that Cindy Buckley, at least I think, is connecting to audio. But let me draw you, while she's connecting, let me draw your attention to an event that we're scheduling now for April 14th, when we look forward to welcoming Balint Magyar for a talk on Poland and Hungary, which he's calling 2 autocratic attempts to overthrow liberal democracy. So we'll cross-list that in CREASE and in CCPS, obviously, and invite you to spread the word. Hi. Oh, there she was. Just for context, Dr. Magyar, who received a doctoral degree in political economy at the University in Budapest, was a member of parliament in Hungary for 20 years, from 1990 to 2010, after having been a human rights activist in the anti-communist opposition movement in the 80s. He was also the Minister of Education twice during the time during which he was an MP. So he's really well positioned based on his background to give us an overview of Poland and Hungary and developments there. And I'm really excited that he'll be joining us for the last CREASE noon lecture on April 14th. First of all, welcome you on behalf of CREASE and of the entire audience. We're delighted to have you here for this noon lecture. I also actually want to welcome any prospective students who are tuning in. This is Prospective Student Visit Day #1, and we'll have a few more for the MIRS program, and we hope that you'll be joining us in the fall. And I'd like to extend a thanks to the Sociology Department for co-sponsoring today's event. So Cynthia Buckley is a professor of sociology at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and she is currently a CREASE visiting scholar for the 2021 academic year here in Ann Arbor, and in fact is physically present in Ann Arbor, even though it's a virtual visit. So we're delighted to have you here and know that you've been able to connect with at least a few people, even in outside spaces. So that's wonderful. Professor Buckley received her PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan in 1991 before she joined the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin. And I think in this context, it's also worth pointing out that she received an MA in CREASE, also from the University of Michigan. Between 2010 and 2012, she served as the program director for Eurasia at the Social Science Research Council, later moving to the Department of Sociology, where she now is at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And she took her CREASE game on the road too, and became the director of CREASE at, or was it at Texas, I guess you were, that was before. It was Texas. Yeah, it was Texas. But she's directed one of these centers herself, so she knows her way in and out of these institutions and events. And it's a real delight to have you join us. Cindy is a social demographer whose research focuses on the main drivers and implications of demographic change across Eurasia, and her work appears in numerous academic journals, policy briefs, assessment reports, and edited volumes. She has a number of research projects ongoing at any given time, and we had our pick. She offered, I think, 3 or 4 completely different topics. So we picked this one on internally displaced persons in Ukraine for today's talk. Her current research focuses on a Minerva-funded investigation of state capacity challenges in the areas of healthcare, including COVID-19, elections, and education in the multicultural countries of Estonia, Georgia, and Ukraine. And she's conducting some of this research together with Ralph Clem and Eric Heron. She's also working on a solo book project on population change and social stability in Central Asia. I'm also going to tack on one more little thing, which is that she has, by my count, advised over 50 MAs and PhDs in her career. And I say that because in joining us at CREASE, she generously offered to serve as a resource for our own students to consult, whether you're in the MA or in the PhD program. If you're in the audience and have questions that you'd like to run by Cindy Buckley and her expertise, she said that you're welcome to do so. So I take the liberty of repeating that here and thanking you again, Cindy, for that generosity. I've mentioned all the upcoming events, so I'm going to hand it over to you and say welcome again. And we look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. And once again, I sincerely apologize for the technological difficulties, but I'm really excited to be here. And it's really an honor to be able to speak to you today. CREASE is an institution that's really near and dear to my heart, as is the sociology department at the University of Michigan. And it's really an honor to speak to you. In my talk today, I'm going to talk about one element of my research, but I'm also going to, for you prospective students, kind of highlight the way in which what I deem the Michigan Mafia or the Michigan Academic Network operates in Eurasia and in population. To a very real extent, all roads really do lead to Ann Arbor, and I'm going to slide that in different parts of my talk. So today we're going to be talking about resettlement or return, shifting IDP attitudes in Ukraine. And this is part of, Liz, could I have the next slide, please? Great. This is part of a project, as Johannes so graciously mentioned in the introduction, that is sponsored by the Minerva Initiative from the U.S. Department of Defense. But just to put this project in perspective, I want to acknowledge I've had a very long-term interest in migration, directing a long-term conference project and edited volume at the Kennan in DC. I chaired the Obama-Medvedev Commission on Migration that brought together Russian and American scholars for 5 years, then got off, then they kept pulling me back in and went and served a second term. I've done some research and consulting for the International Organization of Migration. I've worked as an enumerator and investigator for UNHCR, and interestingly enough, UNAIDS, which specifically in the Southern Caucasus is linked with migration. I'll come back to that in a minute. And I also had a previous NSF and Minerva Award on migration that I had the honor of working on with the amazing Elizabeth Malinkin, who is now Associate Director of CREASE. This current Minerva project, my element is a subaward from the general grant, the Central Eurasian State Capacity Initiative. Eric Heron at West Virginia University, also a Michigan BA, by the way, is the PI, and Ralph Clem is also working with Eric on this. This is a grant from the Office of Naval Research and runs through 2013, probably going to be 2014. We've been a little delayed in our fieldwork this year. I'd like to thank my Illinois GRAs, Samantha Lenook, Elizabeth Schifrin, and Daniel Frumer for their help in some of the maps that you'll see. And I also want to highlight the fact that the paper is a revision of the ASSIS paper I presented in November. This is a new paper for the Association for the Study of Nationalities, and it's available upon request. I'd love to send it to you. If you're interested, just shoot me an email. All that said, all the errors and omissions are only my fault. I also want to point that this links to a future project that is really exciting by that is sponsored by the Norwegian Research Council. That's a grant called, roughly called in English, National Values and Political Reforms in Post-Maidan Ukraine. In Norwegian, it has a really cool acronym, which is VALREF, but I'm still not completely up on my Ukrainian. But this is with my colleague Geir Flick, who is at the University of Oslo. And the reason why I'm so excited to get some feedback on this work today is because I have a request in development, which will become a little clearer how that arose as we go through the talk, by the US State Department, the PRM initiative that's focusing on migration and displacement, to field a study as soon as we can get in on displacement and health in Ukraine. And so I've got a long road that brought me to this area in terms of migration. My dissertation at the University of Michigan, which was directed by Barbara Anderson, who is still on the faculty, focused on migration, and migration has been a long-term solid interest of mine. Liz, could I have the next one, if possible? Okay, so part of this, it's a great question, migration, especially forced migration, for people who study Eurasia. And I think that sometimes we have a tendency to think, or at least people of my age group have a tendency to think data is problematic, data on sensitive issues is particularly trying to obtain. And because of that, forced migration wasn't a really big issue during the Soviet period. Now, I had the delight of defending my dissertation the day after the Soviet Union collapsed. So we've been for several decades now in a post-Soviet world, and forced migration is a really important part of the demographic context and experience of the countries of the former Soviet Union. And as around the globe, in Eurasia, the politics of how we count and how we recognize forced migration matters. And three big things that we need to think about when we're thinking about forced migration in the current Ukrainian context is, first, who counts? Who gets to be called a refugee, who gets to be called IDP, and why? What are the motivations for recognizing some groups and not recognizing others? This is a question that is as applicable in Ukraine right now as it is in the United States. Who are allowed to become forced migrants, which is a different way of thinking about it, and we'll get into that more in a moment. And also to remember that forced migration, in terms of not the individual experience, but the way in which states look at forced migration, is complicated. On the one hand, states are highly motivated to count everyone who's displaced, especially if they are, like the Ukraine, seeking international assistance in providing assistance to this population. Secondly, it's a unique political strategy in terms of how you count and apply the moniker of IDP or refugee. One of the most clear examples, again, comes from Eurasia and the way in which the Azerbaijani government maintained refugee status for everyone who had been who had claimed they were forced to leave Nagorno-Karabakh. Over decades, they were not, they were incentivized to keep that administrative identity. And we see that there's some potential there in another piece I'm writing of the Azerbaijani government playing the long game here, because now those refugees can go back to Nagorno-Karabakh and exert their property rights. There's a political strategy that's involved in terms of who we recognize as IDPs and refugees and who we don't. And lastly, there's great propaganda. It's the idea of being the welcoming Slavic brother, as Russia tried to play in the early period of the Donbas conflict, with highlighting how helpful they were being to individual refugee families who were crossing out of Donbas and into Russia. Also highlighting the fact that people were forced to flee some other state is another way in which propaganda can be utilized to imply that bordering states have no capacity to take care of their population. So the politics of numbers contains a lot of interesting streams, and I leave it to my political science colleagues to dive into this in more detail, and they have in much of the literature. But as a demographer, what I'm interested in is, how does this affect the numbers? How does this affect the data? Right? And when we talk about displacement from the Donbas, in my esteemed view, it is really a raucous cacophony of estimates and assumption. Russia claims that there were, at the high point, 2.5 million people who came out of Donbas. At the same time, the Ukrainian government was arguing that there were 2 million IDPs in Donbas, which, if you really go through, and this isn't the focus of this presentation, but I'm happy to share these data. If you go through the media reports and add up all the estimates of the IDPs, there were very, very few people left in Donbas at any one point or in time. In 2016, if one adds the highest published figure for Russia and the highest public figure for Ukraine, more people left Donbas than actually were counted in Donbas in 2013. And so, as we're talking about this, I'm going to talk about composition and size, but I also really want you to appreciate these numbers are politically constructed, and we need to think of them in that way. The chart I have in this slide shows that the number of registered IDPs, again, these are people who officially registered as internally displaced persons in Ukraine, between the beginning of hostilities in 2014 and 2017, shoots up quite highly. It reaches its highest point in 2016, and then you'll see it starts to decline a bit. That decline has built in it a reflection of individuals who did not maintain their registration as IDPs. So they decided they were going to stay wherever they were. As you might imagine, people are rational actors. And so if assistance for IDPs is high enough, people will stay with that IDP registration. If the assistance is really quite marginal and not very helpful, there's not all that much motivation to keep your registration. And so what we see after 2016 is that the numbers of officially registered IDPs continue to decline. Liz, could I have the next slide? Did we skip migration as a concept? Is there a previous slide? Maybe not.
It's there.
There it is. Okay, great. So when we're thinking about forced migration, and again, this is an amalgam of interests that enumerate what forced migration is, we also need to think about forced migration as a concept. And if we go back to the early 1950s, when the UN was coming up with much of the international law regarding displacement and forced migration, what we realize is there's three core issues to think about. People are fleeing from danger, right? They are being threatened. They have no choice but to leave. There is an assumption in much of the materials, particularly from these original statutes, but increasingly visible throughout the literature, that refugees will seek first refuge, right? You just want to get over the border. You just want to flee for security. And therefore, you're not thinking strategically on where you might want to go, where jobs might be more accessible, for example, where living standards might be higher. or even, unfortunately, in the case of recognition of refugee status, even where you might have family, it makes it much more difficult because we're thinking people take the first refuge they can find. And what's really interesting to me is that cooked into this concept of forced migration is an assumption about time limitation, right? You're not going to be a permanent migrant. You were forced to leave, but you're going to come back. And that increasingly over time has become highly questionable. This is true whether we're looking at the internally displaced from New Orleans when the levees broke. People left, lots of people came back, but many people didn't. And it changed the composition and the structure of the population of NOLA afterwards. The idea of refugees being outside their country until stability returns and that they will go back at some point in time guides much of international law as well as policy by the UN towards refugees. But what we're seeing now in the context of continuous conflict and instability is that refugee camps now, rather than hosting people for a delineated amount of time, are now hosting generations of refugees, and it's a long-term problem. This is reflected by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in 2020, who really said, you know, this is a changed reality. Forced migration now is much more widespread globally, but importantly, it's no longer a short-term or a temporary phenomenon. And so we really have already started to kind of trouble that concept of time delineation. In the next slide, we can think about forced migration as a concept, and we can also think about forced migration as an institutional reflection, right? It is border dependent. If you don't cross an international border, you are an internally displaced person. If you do cross an international border, you are a refugee. It is process dependent, and we know this from the US southern border at our current time. If you can apply for asylum, you can become a potential asylee. If the office is not open or you are not given the opportunity to apply for consideration as a refugee or other type of displaced population, you are not going to have that legible identity, and you're probably not going to show up in this statistics. As we know, it's highly state dependent, and even within states, it's highly dependent upon the current political regime that wields executive power. Forced migration as a legible concept really reflects institutional power dynamics, much more than sort of those three core concepts of the first that we were really thinking about, which is you're fleeing for your life and you're getting away from conflict and you're going to the closest place and you want to return. Forced migration in the way it operates is much more of an institutional reflection. And many scholars, including Randall Hansen, I've got a small quote from him there, have really focused on this idea that forced migration is shaped by international agreements and nation states. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And I apologize for this long windup, but that brings me to the three core questions that motivated me to start looking at displacement in the Donbas. I should be honest with you and say the real thing that motivated me to do displacement in the Donbas was a short consultancy with UNHCR. Because I was trained by Michigan methodologists, and we don't work on elites. We go out, get our boots muddy, and traipse through the displacement centers. But these three intellectual questions made me want to keep working on displacement in the Donbas. The first one is to think about how we can add to the absolutely excellent work on the lived experiences of displacement in Ukraine. And here we have to really call out Greta Euling's recent edited volume, which is fabulous, that has a much more on the ground approach, with many of the chapters really looking at people's lived experiences of displacement. That's great. How do we add to that? Particularly, how do we add to that in a way that can be relevant for policy discussions is one question that's motivating me. Secondly, how can we learn from the Ukrainian Ukrainian experience in order to refine our theoretical approaches and assumptions concerning forced migration. Forced migration is a global phenomenon. It is pervasive and persistent. The Ukrainian case is really a unique one, and it affords unbelievable opportunities to go in and refine and test some of our assumptions, and I think can really contribute to more global demographic analyses of displacement over time. And then thirdly, for me, I'm very interested with this question about the implications of both IDP trends as well as IDP attitudes. And they're looking at return for what the future might hold for Donbas. Now, it's way too early for a sociologist, especially a demographer, to be saying, well, when the war's over, because I think we're very far from being conflict-free in Donbas. But as institutions and governments and the international community move towards rectifying the conflict in Donbas, one has to think about what will happen and what are the challenges that either independent Donetsk and Luhansk or Ukraine will face in reestablishing social services, infrastructure, assistance to citizens who are in that region. And a big part of knowing who's going to be in the region is really thinking about how many of the hundreds of thousands of people who have been displaced are going to return. So in the next slide, just for those of you, I can't imagine any Crease audience not knowing this by heart, but a couple of times at UNHCR, I got about 40 minutes in and someone said, "Where's Donbas?" So here's a map. As many of you know, in 2014, conflicts generally appreciated in the literature as driven by external forces from the Russian Federation, led to Donetsk and Luhansk pulling away from the Ukrainian state post-Maidan and getting a lot of support from the Russian Federation. Donetsk has long been a Russian-speaking area, although there are many Ukrainian speakers there as well. Intense fighting in 2014 and 2015 led to the line of contact you see here, with smaller subsections of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts being identified as separate. No one, the international community does not recognize them as independent states, but LNR and DNR are territories that do not identify with Ukraine. Part of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts are still what we call government-controlled areas, where the red slashes in Donetsk and Luhansk are shown on this map. These are the non-government controlled areas. Crossing over any of the checkpoints that are noted on this map, you will go from an area where the Ukrainian flag is flying and cross a checkpoint and go to a place where they identify as independent states. Not only does this mean that there was a lot of warfare and disruption, and particularly infrastructure damage, and these are things that I've explored in other work I've done on hospital bombings and school bombings, also minings of schools in this region. In addition to infrastructure damage with hospital and schools, we also see damages in extensive damage in residential housing, but also in transportation vectors, both roads, airports, and railways, as well as water systems and sewer systems. And so because of the intensive fighting, particularly in 2014, 2015, many, many people have decided that they are really forced to get out of the region. I add here a chart from a colleague, Robert Hamilton, who has a wonderful article about the development over time of the conflict, and just in case anyone is interested. Suffice to say, at this point, it was a long conflict. So part of that long conflict has to do with the length of time that Ukraine has had to go through both the institutional reflection as well as the reconceptualization of what they mean by forced migrants. For Ukraine, this means focusing on IDPs, or internally displaced persons. And if we go to the next slide, Liz? I'm so sorry. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that here we go. I'm sorry, this is a little busy, but these are the sample details of data on the National Monitoring System reports of internally displaced persons in Ukraine. To date, there have been 17 rounds of data collected. They started in March 2016, and the last report came out in June of 2020 and includes some information about COVID effects, particularly on the IDP population. So I highly recommend them. The citations here in the paper, but for students who are really interested in kind of the big summary scale and some quantitative indicators of what's going on with IDPs in Ukraine, I highly recommend you take a look. Secondly, I also want to give a shout out to my colleagues at IOM, because in a reflection of the fact that they know it's very hard to identify how many IDPs there are and to get them counted and to get a random sample, they did an amazing job of really specifying how many people they were going to count and get surveys from in each one of the rounds of this monitoring survey. And more importantly, they added on, after September of 2016, they added focus groups and interviews into this survey collection process, because they realized without a really clear idea of who was an IDP and where they are and good numerical data, they needed to gather a mixed method of set of indicators and insights into the population. And so whether you are a quantitative or a qualitative interviewer and researcher, you will find data in this repository that can help inform your curiosity about the IDP population over time in Ukraine. This is something that is unthinkable for many other refugee flows and IDP flows in the world. Simply because, first of all, the hostilities went on for a very long time. Secondly, there was huge international support for data collection efforts. And thirdly, by most models, even with my colleagues in Russia, they agree, the majority of people displaced from the Donbas became IDPs. And so you have a rich opportunity to really look at a diverse population that's been displaced and gather some indicators about what their attitudes and experiences are. And for the purposes of this presentation, what's the likelihood that they will return? In the last column of this chart, you'll see there's also, after March 2018, they started doing interviews at border crossings. Because if you remember on the previous map, there are border crossing points between non-government controlled areas and government controlled areas. People fled Donbas because of legitimate fears, but that doesn't mean they don't go back to check on the cow they left at their rural residence, to check on neighbors who refused to leave, to come into Ukraine to pick up pension payments. This was particularly important in 2014, 15, and 16. There is an amazing amount of border traffic right up to the shutdown in February of last year due to COVID. But 3 of the checkpoints have even reopened since the end of May 2020. And even during the COVID period, we still have several hundred people going back and forth across these borders. And so it also kind of challenges our idea of displacement, that you want to flee and it's really dangerous. In this case, people have fled, and sometimes they go back and sometimes they don't. And one individual I know personally that I interviewed said he goes back every Tuesday and every Thursday because he needs to check on his house, and he needs to check on his neighbors. There are many families that just live over the contact line that are what we would call frequent flyers across these checkpoints. These are also brought into this database by the International Organization for Migration. So looking at this data and taking into consideration my 3 core questions, on the next slide, I list some hypotheses that I started my investigation with. The first have to do with where, right? And this is the idea that, where are people settling? Is it true that you just go to the first safe haven? Early in 2014, most people were going just over the conflict line and settling in refugee resettlement areas that were concentrated near Donetsk and Luhansk. Over time, more and more IDPs chose initially upon registration to ask for resettlement help farther away. Additional groups within the IDP population asked for resettlement farther away because they had family in Western Ukraine, because they had contacts in the capital city of Kiev. And so this idea of first refuge with IDPs becomes a little bit more complicated. Based on what I had seen during my consulting gig, I found that households with vulnerable members, particularly households with children, had a tendency to want to get as far away from the conflict as possible. If we think about responsibility and taking care of the kids, this makes complete and total sense. This also has to do with the fact that many IDP households with children who were, especially if they were young children, wanted to go to places where there was less demand on IDP services, and so that there wasn't going to be a line to get school documentation or healthcare, etc. So this, coupled with my growing database on the number of schools that had either been shelled or mined during the conflict, made great sense to me. I thought IDP households with kids are going to go far. IDP households with pensioners would tend to settle in regions close to the conflict zone. Again, based on observational data, people at later stages in life, and particularly people who were pension dependent, needed to be within striking distance of the property and assets that they were leaving in the non-government zone. And so I had some idea that we were going to see some shifting in terms of who goes where. In terms of integration, I also thought because of density, IDPs resettled in regions far from the conflict area, so people who went clear to the other side of Ukraine, would tend to display higher integration levels and less desire to return. In part, this is a selectivity effect. If you want to get out of a war zone and you never want to see it again, you're going to go as far as you can. In part, this is also a destination effect. People going farther away from the conflict zone tended to have better opportunities for integration, get the kids in school. Once the kids are in school, you never want to move. And I really was interested in what was going to happen in terms of, are any of these people really going to want to go back to Donbas, and will it change over time? Lastly, my hypothesis about IDPs who chose to be resettled near the conflict area, this made me think they probably aren't really going to try and integrate into the local economy and local society, and they've got a high desire to return. Part and parcel of this was informed by spending 2 weeks on the checkpoints between the borders. People who were going back and forth all articulated this desire that they knew they had lots of assets, whether they were emotional assets or physical assets in the conflict zone, and they were staying nearby to keep an eye on those assets. So those were the hypotheses that I generated from my observations. Let's see what the data say in terms of some of these. This map, and I want to give a shout out to Jared Fox, one of my RAs who made this, shows that the internally displaced as of 2020 are highly concentrated near the conflict zone as a whole. But if we look at the percent, we go down and look at the percent of displaced children, and this is children under 17, what you find is that they are far away from the conflict zone. They tended not to settle near the line of conflict. If we look at the people that were displaced who are in the prime working ages, so they're going to be younger than pensioners, again, they are going to be more concentrated farther away from the conflict zone. And that dark dot you see in that map is the capital city of Kiev, where wages are higher and employment opportunities were good. If we want to look at pensioners among the displaced, we do see this concentration of them settling by 2020 right near the conflict zone for the reasons that I pointed out. So we've got a little bit of support for that right here. In the next map, we see the percent of sampled IDPs who are of employment age, right? How many of them got jobs after displacement? And so this was within 12 months of being displaced. And I also want to point out, this isn't the most recent survey because they didn't ask it, but this is as of March 17th. Did you get a job within the first 12 months of your displacement? And I think this tells us a lot about the way in which the IDP population was selected. If you were close, right? If you were close to the conflict zone in Kharkiv, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, you had a fairly low probability of being employed after displacement. And this isn't pensioners, these are only for people 18 to 59. The farther out you go, the higher the probability you will get employed. So much so that by the time you reach the far western part of Ukraine, almost half of our IDPs, 45%, report finding employment within the first 12 months. If we go to the next map, we'll see that in addition to that sort of economic integration, which is my proxy for that is finding employment, IDPs themselves report higher feelings of integration in their community of resettlement the farther as they go farther away from the conflict zone. So if they move farther away, they are reporting higher levels of feeling integrated in their community. Now, it's not completely linear. You'll see that people right around the conflict zone in what is the government-controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk, about half of them feel pretty integrated. I think that in part that's related to the density of IDPs there. It's easy to be integrated in a community when IDPs are the majority of the population. It goes down when you get to Kharkiv, Dnipro and Zaporizhia, and then it starts to go quite a bit up. In central Ukraine, about 2/3 feel that they're integrated. In Kiev, 3/4 of the IDPs report feeling integrated into the local community, and in the farthest west, 65%. So this pattern, I think, is fascinating, and is both cause and effect in terms of the density of the IDP population, but also the way in which people see themselves. And I think that this is strongly related to the next map, which is about the percent of the sampled IDPs with no intention to return. And this was from June of 2020. And what we see is people who stayed near the conflict zone, only 28% of them said absolutely no intention of returning. And the number of saying no intention of returning gets higher again, the farther away you get from the conflict zone. And what we find is that in the center and west, we're really looking at nearly over 60% of IDPs there, the vast majority saying, no, I have absolutely no intention of returning. And the question that was asked for this indicator was, would you return after hostilities ceased? And so clearly we've got a lot of IDPs who have no intention to return, and it is highly affected by the region in which they are settled. So if I could have the next slide. In terms of progress and insights, I think first the insights into lived experiences that Greta and her colleagues and many, many other fascinating anthropologists, sociologists, and political scientists have gathered are absolutely vital and super important. They're also amazing to read, and I highly recommend them. And if you want the paper, I've got a long lit review of them. This data that I'm talking about today displays patterning in resettlement, integration, and returning. And this points to the importance of regional level variation. And so that as we try to generalize from these more lived experience reports, we're seeing pretty strong patterning by region that helps us move a little bit further down the analytical pathway. Secondly, issues of resettlement choice and agency, right? The ability to make that choice need further analysis. People are not just fleeing across the border. People are not randomly selecting places of resettlement. IDPs are exerting preferences in resettlement based on family structure, or at least we have some strong indications to be suspicious of that. And that requires further analysis. And thirdly, who returns and how many return are highly likely to influence the ability of the state to reestablish services, in the parlance of my current project, to reestablish state capacity upon the cessation of hostilities. And because of that, I think it's really important to think very carefully about the diversity of the current IDP population in Ukraine, where they decided to resettle, and the effective region. And then thirdly, who's coming back after the cessation of hostilities. Will Donbas be a haven of pensioners? Is it the new Miami? It's too early to know. But from the point of the Ukrainian state, thinking about who's coming back and what characteristics are likely to be dominant in that migration trend is of incredible importance, not only in terms of the ethnicity of the return stream, but also the age and household composition of that return stream. And thinking about this now as hostilities continue is imperative if there's going to be effective strategies for state capacity establishment once hostilities cease. Okay, and now the final slide. Okay, some limitations, some implications, and some next steps. Okay, so limitations. Is it representative? It's hard to say. These are very large surveys for the IDP population, but because we don't know everyone who's displaced, there is no way of knowing whether these data are statistically representative of all IDPs in Ukraine. Long, long nights on Skype and many beers with another Michigan graduate, my friend Ted Gerber at the University of Wisconsin. We have tried every which way we could to come up with some weighting schemes and some further analysis for that. And I have to say, for solid statistical representativity, these data are highly limited. And I think that really, even with all the bells and whistles that I was taught by the amazing Professor Leslie Kish back when I was in graduate school, I really don't recommend it. So I think, again, these data are indicative, but they are not representative. Even though they're not representative, I think they still provide a great opportunity. And the next step in this is individual analysis and multi-level, multivariate models. We're going to run these and then use qualitative insights already collected to help construct these models, which is a really great way to move things along. Another limitation of this, however, is the effect of COVID. And so that's something that we're still grappling with. There are a million limitations. The individual level data has taken me 9 months, and I just counted it up today, 433 separate emails to get access to. I've been promised it's going to arrive on Friday. Check back. I'm not holding my breath, but the individual data should be coming soon. So next, the implications of this study. In my mind, I think the implications really help us think about the need to refine our assumptions about IDPs, but also to really think about two standard sociological themes in the IDP experience: the duration of displacement and how that changes attitudes and integration, and also the stage in life course. Being displaced when you're a child is one thing. Being displaced when you're a pensioner might be something very different. And so really taking a life course and duration perspective to this, I think has big implications. And to my look at the data, they are really well supported. Lastly, winning the peace may be complicated by the selectivity of IDP return. And I think that this is a really important area that requires attention. In my constant battle to get the individual level data, I was in close contact with the PRM group at State Department who works on displacement. They funded part of this IOM survey, and we're in negotiations to potentially field a new survey next year, hopefully when Ukraine reopens. Watch this space and let me know if you'd like to be posted on those developments. In terms of our next steps, as I said, we're going to try for this individual level data. It should be coming soon. We're also planning for a lot of field work, and our fingers are crossed. There's all sorts of new opportunities, and so I really welcome any insights, comments, or even future collaborators who might be interested in this line of research. So I ended before the tornado warning, I hope. And I really appreciate this chance to discuss this with you. Finally, my last Michigan Mafia piece is that one of the reasons why the US State Department PRM has been helping me get this data is because two of the people who are gatekeepers at the subunit that works on displacement are indeed graduates of a specific Big Ten school. I'll let you guess which one it was. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Or I guess that's it. I have got questions.
Thank you, Cindy. Yeah, we prefer to call it a network.
So forgive me, those of us in it call it the Michigan Mafia.
I'm sure we do. So thanks so much. This was absolutely fascinating, and lots obviously to think about, think through, and we're happy to have your help to continue to do so. There are a number of questions already in the Q&A, and I invite people to add theirs. I'm not sure if you're able to pull that up on your phone. So first of all, I hugely appreciate the fact that you went through all the tech troubles and are here. Thanks again. And I'm happy to field the questions, some of which overlap with ones that I would have also raised on my own. So I'm going to get out of the way and let other people ask. The first is Arthur Mangozi, who's a student in the MIRS program. Thanks you for your presentation, and says, I noticed that there is an isolated but pronounced increase in integration closer to the Moldovan border and Kiev city, which is something that I think a number of us picked up on. Given the projects of both Maia Sandu and Zelensky to develop proximity with the EU, would you say there's a measurable connection between integration and the relative presence of Europeanness or Eurocentrism in the community?
My suspicion is absolutely right. And I think that's an incredibly insightful comment. And as we get these individual data, one thing that I've been bouncing around with Ted as well moving forward is trying to integrate a measure from the 2020 Ukraine World Values Survey on European orientation as one of our factors that we put into the multi-level analysis. And so I appreciate your insight on that question very, very much.
A question also linked in interesting ways to something you said at the very end about life cycles or duration, or where people are in their lives, from Roman Hrisiv. I'm sure that was not the way you pronounce your last name, Roman. I apologize. Who says he's a faculty member in the College of Engineering here and would like to suggest another explanations for your observations regarding IDPs, namely, the younger the Donbas Ukrainian, the more likely the person is to be pro-Ukrainian, pro-European, so it goes into the same direction, and more likely to speak Ukrainian. This would also explain why they adapt and integrate more quickly into Western Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
I think that's a great alternative hypothesis, and I really appreciate that. I will certainly, Roman, take that under serious consideration. One of my concerns, however, is that, and I could be making a mistake here, so I really need to take your comment very seriously. When I'm talking about youth, I've been looking at people under 17. And while this isn't, my time in Ukraine has shown me that many of them, even in rural areas, are infinitely more politically engaged than some of our youth under 17 in Illinois, shall we say. I'm not completely sure how that affects. And my other concern is they're not making the decisions where the household goes, right? So people with school-age kids are going to be younger than pensioners just because of biology, but the kids themselves aren't driving, they're not making the resettlement decision. But I think you're absolutely right. And looking at households and heads of households in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, or maybe even finer detail in terms of age is really important. And I'm writing that note right down, and I appreciate that comment very much. It's really, I think you're right on the money.
Great. Arina Vlasova, who's also a student in the MIRS program, asks, thanks you too for your presentation, and asks, since both Donbas and Luhansk are both historically coal mining regions, the hardships that miners are experiencing due to mines being shut down have significantly worsened after the events of 2014. Is there any data on the number of minor IDPs?
There, up until round, let me make sure I've got this right. Up until March of 2017, there was a broad occupational category. So you got everybody who was involved in mining. Now that doesn't mean they were miners, right? And so my suspicion is you need a lot more finer detailed work and more perhaps investigations on the lived experience line to really get at the problems of miners who are displaced, because you're so wise to point this out. That is not necessarily a human capital skill that is mobile, right? So if you are a bookkeeper, that's a much more mobile element of human capital. If you're a miner, you got to go where there's mines. But your question also, I think I would love to talk to you in depth about this. I think your question is really important also in terms of who's going to return. If your skills can only be used in Donbas, you're going to be more likely to go back. So that's one thing about who's likely to go back. But secondly, the number of collapsed mines, the number of shelling incidences that have been associated with water contamination and land contamination linked to the mines in the Donbas also point to huge problems for the Ukrainian state as it tries to reestablish state capacity, because some regions and some mines in this region are really going to be questionable in terms of resettlement possibility due to pollution that stems from the conflict. So thank you for that that comment, because Donbas is minor territory, and it's worse for minors in some ways simply because their wage rates were quite high in Donbas, making their relative status for those who chose to become IDPs, they are mostly facing huge decreases in terms of wage rates, and that has got to make integration and satisfaction really challenging for those families. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Roman follows up just to say that mine was not an alternate explanation, just an additional one.
Yeah. Oh, and I got it down. Unfortunately, have your name, so I'll be sending you an email next week.
Olga Vierhovskaya says, fascinating research. Are you planning or are you aware of similar studies about the people who crossed into Russia, other direction?
So I'm working with Sergei Ryantsev to try and get something started. Olga, I think it's critical to understand both sides of this migration flow, and we can't really get at selectivity unless we can look at who went into Ukraine versus who went into Russia. The problem being is that who went into Ukraine is much more legible due to the heavy presence of UNHCR. Who went into Russia, not only did Russia not seek external support for the refugees that they hosted and welcomed, there was no national program for refugee resettlement. This was done by governors, and I'm a bit out of my depth on this. I'm not a political scientist, but it certainly reads to me that this was a situation where regional governors accepted certain numbers of refugees to their district as a means of pleasing the Putin regime, since it was said to be a high priority. I haven't gone back and tested how that did or did not predict their longevity as governor or the amount of money that their region received from the central budget. But I think that that's a great dissertation waiting to be written. And so we're hoping to get some work done on this, but it's highly problematic because there isn't a centralized registry. And for those of you who work in Russia, it is politically a very difficult time to field American-Russian research on sensitive topics in the socio-political realm, but we're hopeful. And if you have any ideas or suggestions, or if you're interested in that at all, would you please drop me an email, because I'd love to talk to you.
Maybe I can tack on, because it occurred to me while you were talking along this line of thinking, is Crimea like a comparative case in any way? Does it factor into the way you think about this, or other people working on it?
Yeah, there are several other amazing scholars, both in Ukraine and in Western Europe and in North America, who are focusing on the Crimean situation, particularly looking at ethnic Ukrainians displaced versus ethnic Tatars displaced. And I think that work is fascinating. To keep this simple, I just cut out from the survey of IDPs anybody who was from Crimea, simply because it was a different time period and it was also a different reference point. The numbers are small as well, because the number of people displaced from Crimea was so much smaller. And again, this is just a small sample, even if it's 4,000 people, it's not the entire IDP community. And so your point is great. And my goodness, if anybody's interested in sharing some data, I would really love to include a comparison with the Crimean displacement, because I think you've got the added twist of being displaced and going in, being resettled in a place where you're an ethnic minority as well, and in some cases a linguistic minority. And so it's a fascinating case for another really energetic and bright young student. So
Next question comes from our colleague Pam Ballinger, and it's a little longer, so I'll read it slowly, but hopefully it's clear enough. There are many parallels, she writes, to the former Yugoslavia in terms of the protracted nature of the conflict and the many IDPs, as well as refugees, produced by the conflict. And the line between IDPs and refugees was often blurry, as ethnic Croats from Herzegovina displaced into Croatia were treated differently, akin to IDPs, than non-Croats displaced from Bosnia into Croatia, for example. This is something I also have a question about, but I'm going to stick with Pam's. Pam, then, is wondering about whether, and if so, how, lessons have been applied from cases like the former Yugoslavia to the management and study of displacement in Ukraine. Likewise, anthropologist Elizabeth Dunn's work on Georgia has stressed the ad hoc nature of much relief work there, what she calls adhocracy.
Mm-hmm.
So my question really is, says Pam, does each conflict and crisis create its own forms of adhocracy, or have Ukraine and your organizations working in Ukraine drawn on painful recent lessons in other areas with protracted conflicts and displacement?
So Pam, that's a brilliant question, loaded with insight, and I really appreciate it. The Yugoslav case, of course, is in terms of timeline, as well as in terms of the number of people displaced, is clearly part of the comparative context, and it's the case that comes to mind. It is the case that's discussed often at UNHCR offices across Ukraine. Many of the people that I've met working in Ukraine on IDP services actually also had some experience in international agency work in Yugoslavia. So there's definitely a bleed over on clear indications that or articulations of, we did this in Ukraine and it didn't work, or we did this in former Yugoslavia and it didn't work, so we're going to do something different in Ukraine. I have not been privy to those conversations. If they have occurred, I certainly haven't seen them in a lot of the official reports either. One of the things that makes the situation in Ukraine much less challenging in some ways is the fact that it tends to be, it's not completely, but it tends to be dominantly Ukrainian ethnic IDPs. There doesn't seem to be a statistically significant difference in resettlement patterns, age composition, or levels of self-reported levels of integration between non-Ukrainians, whether they are Russians, Poles, because Donbas did have a diverse population. Russians, Poles, Moldovans, Tatars, they're not looking different in the data that I have access to. In terms of their lived experience, however, working their way through both being an IDP as a concept and being an IDP as an institutional reflection, I have to admit, I don't have that. But it's certainly important, and I'm going to write that down now. And it bless you for mentioning Professor Dunn's work. I'm very disappointed that she is, as of today, as of yesterday, she was in Montana, but she is out doing what is going to be fabulous work on meatpacking plants in the United States. Unfortunately, I would love to kidnap her as soon as the borders open and take her to Ukraine with me. But I love the reference that you have here to adhocracy. I don't want to go too far afield. I also don't want to prevent myself from ever getting another consultancy, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. I think that international organizations, those of us who work with international organizations that are brought in to intervene in crises and conflicts, know that adhocracy is a very, very apt description of many sorts of programs and processes that by chance or by design seem to emerge as emergent and new needs are addressed in very high stakes, high conflict zones. I think that to a certain extent, the uniqueness of Ukraine is that adhocracy was somewhat dampened by the effect that immediately in 2014, there was concerted and fairly well funded within the realm of things. I'm not saying the IDPs received that funding, but there was a lot of funding that went into UNHCR and the EU backing refugee assistance. Now, did it work? That's another question that's really important and well worth exploring. I think that needs a little bit more boots on the ground time than I've been able to have over the last year and a half. But I would argue that one of the ways in which you really saw a huge muck up in terms of state policy and IDPs, even with all these people flying in and out from Geneva and all these international consultants, was in pension payments. And the fact that in the early years, people had to cross the checkpoints, had to cross in and out to get their pensions. To me, that points to the limitations of quick and concerted international intervention in terms of helping the efficacy of how a state would respond to the IDP crisis. And I know that doesn't answer your insightful and extraordinarily valuable comment, but I hope it puts in a little bit. And Pam, thank you very much for pointing that out.
So I'm going to tack on one last question of my own, which kind of comes out of this, but also out of a course that I teach on cinema and migration, where we address some of these issues. And I took note of your reference to the Randall Hansen article on refugees and borders. I mean, adhocracy, which is a term that I just learned.
It's great, isn't it?
Yes,
That's,
and I take your, go ahead.
Liz, it's Elizabeth. She's amazing. Yeah.
So and I take your point that, you know, things on the ground do develop in ad hoc ways, and there's probably good reason for it. At the same time, as anybody who works in this area knows, going back to the, you know, at least the mid-century, to the human rights regimes and frameworks and terms really matter. So my question is about the IDP category. One of the texts that we read in my seminar is a legal scholar writing in the mid-'80s. So I don't know how you know how up to date that is, but the question that he asks is an ethical one, and he says, where do we draw the line beyond which somebody can become a refugee? And legally, that usually has to do with persecution and alienation. In other words, you're driven out of your country, and the border matters, right? Now, both the situation that Pam describes and the situation that you describe are incredibly messy, ethnic, new borders, permeable, semi-permeable borders. So the IDP category makes sense in a certain way, but are there discussions where people clamor for refugee status, where they say that the IDP status is not the right instrument to capture all this, and that these people should be refugees? Is that something one should be asking, or does that just muddle the issue even more?
Oh, I think you point to an issue that I've written about elsewhere, that the reason why IDPs are so problematic in terms of the way in which they are in a institutional reflection is the fact that refugees, once recognized, fall under a imperfect and incomplete, but still existent set of international guidelines, expectations, and laws. Internally displaced people are citizens, and they oftentimes are not traceable. They oftentimes are not counted. They oftentimes are not provided with any assistance. They oftentimes are provided with assistance that is particularly subpar. And it becomes highly problematic when the internally displaced are minority ethnic, minority racial, regionally marginalized people. And in those cases, a state may not respond to the extent they would if it was a different population that's being displaced, but they are internal and therefore not covered by these these existent international structures. And so IDPs in many ways are more marginalized in terms of being able to trace and quantify and protect in comparison to refugees. So certainly crossing that international border can sometimes be helpful. But I really had to smile because I think both you and Pam were brilliant in the way that you made me think about what happened on the 11th of May in 2014. And the wording of the referendum for separation in Donetsk and Luhansk, right? The word on the ballot was, and now watch me butcher this, samostoятельность, right? It basically was a little bit open to interpretation. Were they voting for regional autonomy? Were they voting for a different sort of administrative status? Or were they just voting to stand on their feet alone as a separate government? They didn't ask about a legally different state. The words that were used in that referendum that started the whole ball rolling really point to this idea that we reify the boundaries of the nation state as something real and concrete and meaningful. But for people on the ground, those might not be the borders that they consider in terms of crossing to a different reality or to a different area or a different area of authority when they are displaced. And so that IDP refugee line becomes highly problematic.
Which it seems to me makes work like yours all the more important. So thank you for it, which is also what Pam says in the last comment that's in our Q&A. She says, this was great. Thank you, Pam. And thank you, Cindy. I'm going to second that and say how pleased we are that we were able to bring you and have you here, and hope to see you around Ann Arbor, and see everybody else, and maybe you, if you're interested, next week at a panel on Albanian literature.
That's going to be great. For the prospective students that are looking at Michigan, one more push, and remember, I'm not even a faculty member at Michigan. CREASE is an amazing institution. It will tie you into a network that will give you amazing opportunities around the world. When you're looking at a MA program, or you're thinking about what your next steps are in building your career, you really can't make a mistake by becoming part of the Michigan network. Is that better? And I want to encourage you to take a look at it seriously. And if you want a perfectly objective perspective as you're making your decisions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm bunkered up here in Carytown. Happy to go out to coffee at any time, and also happy to talk to any of the graduate students or prospective students that might arise.
There's nobody I'd rather be in a mafia with, Cindy. Thanks very much.
We'll pull you back in. You're in.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of the afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.